how did you start researching ketones and their role in brain energetics?
By accident. It wasn't something I planned. And sometimes the most interesting research we do or the results we find are things that we don't anticipate. And I was studying omega-3 fatty acid metabolism in the brain. It was something I did during my postdoctoral studies. I had some techniques that allowed us to what they call put a stable isotope tracer. So not a radioactive tracer, but a stable isotope. So no radioactivity involved whatsoever. But if the molecule is labeled with this tracer, you can find out where it goes. And we were expecting to see A get changed to B to C in the omega-3 pathway. If people know about that, that's to produce docosahexaenoic acid, the omega-3 fatty acid. But we found, yes, that there was a fair amount of production of this labeled DHA, but there was 10 to 20 times more of the carbon from the starting fatty acid in other molecules like cholesterol and palmitic acid and saturated fatty acids in the brain. And I was stunned because it wasn't we weren't looking for it. And to cut a long story short, we were able to trace that back to the fact that some of the process how that happens is because there's a fair amount of oxidation, not oxidative stress oxidation, but what's called beta oxidation, which is using a fatty acid as a fuel. And when you break it down during early brain development, you end up making ketones, and those ketones are used as a fuel. But perhaps equally importantly, they're also used to make new fats in the brain. Because the brain makes, during early development, the brain makes its own cholesterol, it makes its own saturated fatty acids, it builds its own fat structure in the brain. And key part of that I learned was via ketones. So I was, totally struck by this. And it's either something you forget about and you turn the page on it and you carry on with what you were doing before.
Yeah.
But I couldn't keep the lid on that story for very long. And I was intrigued and I learned that there was an old history back in the 1950s and 60s of people doing research on this, including by major pioneers like Hans Krebs, who was responsible for the Krebs citric acid cycle, which is an absolutely fundamental part of biochemistry and metabolism. And it was one of his favorite topics. So
Yeah.
I thought if it's good enough for him, it's sure as heck good enough for me as well. And let's just see where this goes. And so that's how I got started. And then I wanted to learn more about how they got metabolized, and I couldn't really do that in Toronto. My personal life got me more interested in coming back to Quebec, where I had grown up. And when I learned that Sherbrooke had a marvelous imaging center, and we wanted to hire somebody that could eventually start studying ketone imaging with PET imaging facilities, I jumped at the opportunity for both personal and professional reasons to come to Sherbrooke, and here we are.
Yeah, that's amazing. What I'm hearing is ketones are core to all of these the fat creation in the brain, um, and they're really integral to the infant brain, right? The early childhood development, the energy metabolism of an early child. Um, ketone, so ketogenic therapy, some of that old research you talked about, um, ketogenic therapies have been used for infantile seizures, right?
Yeah. Well, so that came out in the early '90s. It's about 100-year-old story, but it was mostly kept under wraps. And unless you had some interest in seizures, chances are you didn't know about it
Yeah.
until Meryl Streep did a movie
Right.
um, about this called First Do No Harm
Yeah.
around 1992. I don't remember exactly, but it was around about the same time I stumbled over this story about ketones and brain lipid in early infant development. You're absolutely right that they do play a physiological role in early brain development, and we can come back to that.
Yeah.
But these two things came together for me, and I learned more or less from that movie, and then from the research that led to that movie, that yes, ketogenic diet has been used. It was ostensibly the only therapeutic application of ketones was in infantile seizures. And it was considered at first, 100 years ago, there was no treatment for these seizures at all.
Right.
So it became the only treatment. And as soon as drugs were developed, lithium, valproate, and a series of other drugs, it led to let's try the drugs. And then when the drugs worked, yeah, it's obviously a simpler solution to the disease than trying to have such a dramatic restriction in carbohydrate intake in a child. And for how long, no one knew at the time either. Yeah. So it was always pushed to the back burner as an option. Yeah. And only when the drugs failed would people come back to it. And only in a couple of centers. You're not far from the original, historically, the site where this was most developed, which is in Baltimore. I guess it's some distance down the road from you, but still, that's where the continuity between the 1920s and the 1990s, that's about the only place where the link was held. If we'd broken that link somewhere, I think it would have disappeared. Wow. So thank goodness to the people, John Freeman and colleagues, Sam Livingston before him, who kept that link alive, and for very legitimate reasons. The families that benefited from it, and the reason that movie was made was because it can have a dramatic beneficial effect and lead to a remission of epilepsy totally. Wow. Not in everyone, but in a high enough percentage that it's a very legitimate approach. Yeah. Wow. And I think it helps to literally rewire the brain, because the infant brain is still developing and it's still time to let ketones do their job. Yeah. And mother's milk contributes to ketogenesis in the infant because there are medium chain triglycerides in the milk fat in mother's milk. So it's not a coincidence that ketones are important for brain development. They're furnished, they're supplied to the infant on a daily basis for as long as they're on milk. Wow. Mother's milk.
Yeah. That's amazing. That's amazing. I mean, ketones are central to energy in the brain for an infant. And
there's not enough glucose in getting into the brain of an infant to keep the brain working normally.
Makes total sense.
So they are an essential fuel. We talk about them as an alternate fuel, and only when you have a low carbohydrate intake, fasting, energy restriction, blah, blah, blah. That's true in adults. But in infants, they're an essential fuel. Yeah. So I think that as you rightly surmise, I think they're not only important for early brain development, but they're probably the reason that we are the smart species amongst the primates and the mammals and so on, is because we were able to channel a source of energy out of ketones and out of the fats to help supply the enormous energy requirements of the newborn baby. Wow. Of the brain of the newborn baby, which takes about 70% of its energy requirements when it's born. I think you mentioned you've got children, and when they're born, they can't do anything, right, except make a lot of noise and
exactly.
Make a mess.
Exactly. Yeah.
And yet the brain is consuming 70% of its of the infant's energy requirements, and about a third of that is supplied by ketones.
Yeah.
In part to help build a connection so that they can start to coordinate movement. And so on, to learn to speak and to walk and all that stuff.
Wow.
So that's the physiology of ketones. And if we can exploit that in adults to help correct problems that have developed, then so much the better. It's a physiological mechanism that we're trying to return to.